Melissa from Melly Sews and Blank Slate Patterns here today. I'm going to be showing you how to use elastic thread to make this shirred waist skirt. It's got a nice stretchy comfy waistband that you create with woven fabric and using this elastic thread on the inside. So let's check out what supplies we're going to need and then we'll start making this easy skirt. So I've got my supplies here. The things I'm going to be using, I've just got a big panel of fabric and I've already done one thing to it, which is to sew it into a loop. And I've done that just by sewing the seam here and going ahead and finishing it. Now this loop is 1.5 times my waist measurement. For a larger waist, you may have to sew 2 pieces of fabric together, especially depending on the length you want and depending on the direction of the print. This is a directional print on mine, so this is the only way I wanted to orient my fabric for this particular garment. However, if I had a non-directional print, I could have, and I wanted a shorter skirt, for example, I could have gone with the lengthwise yardage of the skirt instead of the widthwise, which this is widthwise. These were the selvages right here. So anyways, I've sewn a seam and I've finished it. If you have more than one skirt panel that you're needing to use, you sew 2 seams and you finish them. And then you've got a skirt in a loop here. The other thing I've gone ahead and done already is this is going to be the top edge of my skirt, and I have pressed in a very narrow 1/4 inch hem here. So I'm going to stitch that when I get over to the machine, but for now that's just pressed in. The other special tools that we're going to be using is this. This is elastic thread, and it stretches, and this is what's going to create all those gathers and ruffling. I will be using my iron as well for that, and I'll show you that'll be the last step. When you hit this elastic thread with steam, it really like crinkles up and pulls in, and that's what you want for this project. So elastic thread comes on a spool that looks like this, and the spool of thread I just place it on my machine and I go ahead and I wind my bobbin on the machine. Now you're going to find some tutorials around the internet that will tell you to hand wind this. I've always had better luck personally with winding it on my bobbin. However, I have always sewn on a drop-in bobbin machine, which is where the bobbin sits flat in the machine. If you have a side-loading bobbin where the bobbin sits in a little casing sideways, it may work better to hand wind your bobbin. This is really a technique that I would encourage you to practice on a scrap of fabric first to see how your specific machine responds to it, and also to judge how much shrinkage you're going to get from the elastic thread. Normally with this particular thread, which I believe this is just the Dritz brand, when I use this I get about a shrinkage by about half. So if I have something that's 10 inches long, when I'm done sewing and pressing it, it'll end up about 5 inches long. And that, of course, you need to take into account when you are cutting your skirt with. How much is it going to shrink and how much do you want to stretch it to keep it on? That's how I came up with the 1.5 measurement. If I had done 2 times the length of my waist, I would have ended up with a skirt that would shrink to my waist size, but there wouldn't be any stretch. Much stretch to keep it on my waist. I want it to stretch a little more to hold it in place. So that's where I'm going with using the fabric. Is going to shrink to a little bit smaller than my waist so that I have to stretch it out to fit on my waist. All right, let's go over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how I'm going to sew this hem and how I'm going to use the elastic thread. So here we are at the machine. I've got it threaded with the regular thread in the bobbin and on top that I'm going to be using for my top little hem here. And all I'm going to do is get my folded edge, which I didn't pin because I pressed it and it's holding the pressed edge pretty well. But if you'd like to press it, you definitely can. And then I actually am going to put this almost as far over on the presser foot as I can. And then I'm going to move the needle to the side so that the needle is actually hitting, and I can feel right here so I can tell where I need it to hit. But I want the needle to be hitting the hem that I'm making and not have it be over here since it's such a narrow hem. The more fabric you can get under the presser foot, the better this is going to feed and the easier this is going to be to sew. So that's why I'm moving my fabric and my needle over instead of leaving my needle in the default position and trying to center my fabric under it. So once I've got that in position, I am just going to stitch. Okay, so now that I've got this hem formed on top, I'm going to clip my threads, and you may have noticed I was sewing on the right side of the fabric, and that's important when we shirr as well, because we want to be on the right side of the fabric so that that elastic thread is on the back side, not visible on the front. So I'm going to switch out my bobbin thread now for the elastic thread, and I'm going to lift my presser foot here because normally on my machine, once you put the thread in, you just kind of cut it off there and you leave it and you start stitching. I have found that that's not very effective for the elastic thread. You need it to be coming out through the hole on the plate here before you start sewing. So I'm going to hold my upper thread to the side, and I'm going to reset my needle to the center and hand crank my machine until it catches and pulls up that elastic thread. And this often, because it's elastic and it's stretchy, this often takes me kind of 2 stitches before I can get it, and even then sometimes it won't. So sometimes what I have to do is redo the bobbin and leave, instead of cutting the thread off like I would with normal thread, I need to leave some extra hanging out. So let's try that again. We're going to hand crank and catch that bobbin thread, and then get it to pull up through the throat plate here. There we go. If your finger doesn't quite fit under your presser foot, you can also use scissors. And you use scissors just kind of like that to sweep it through and get the threads. Now, I'm not going to want all of this long thread to trim off of my skirt, but I am going to leave a tail on this elastic thread because I'm going to want to tie it to knot it off when after I start. So I'm just going to find my seam here because that's where I want to start. And I'm sewing on the right side, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the edge of my presser foot with the edge of my fabric for this first row of elastic thread here. And I'm going to start right on that seam line, and then I am just going to stitch. Oh, one more thing. You need to lengthen your stitch length to the longest stitch that it will do. That's going to help with the gathering as well. Now you can sort of see back here that my fabric is already starting to gather a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and stitch around, and we will time lapse a little bit so you can see what happens on the second row. Okay, that was fast. I've come back around and I'm back to where I started stitching. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stitch just a couple stitches just till I meet that row. Then I'm going to lift my needle and lift my presser foot, and I am just going to move over until that line that I started stitching is now even with the edge of my presser foot. You can already see how my fabric has gathered. So as I stitch this row, I want to make sure to hold the fabric flat as it's going under the needle. I don't want to be sewing those wrinkles in place. I do want it to gather, but we don't want it to pucker with wrinkles. There's a little bit of a difference. So let's time lapse again so you can see what it looks like after I've done a few rows of this. Okay, I have sewn several rows that you can see here, but then I ran out of bobbin thread, and this is going to happen to you in this project because this elastic thread does not wind as much thread onto a bobbin as normal thread would, partly because it's thicker and partly because it's stretchy, so it feels like you're winding on more than you actually are. So if that happens, and when it happens, you may want to have extra bobbins prepared. If you don't, just stop and reload your bobbin. And then you're just going to want to find where you left off stitching, which for me was right here. You want to overlap behind by at least an inch or so of stitching, and you want to leave those long tails again, and just go ahead and overlap the previous stitching and go ahead and continue to stitch. The nice thing about this elastic thread, because it is creating those gathers and ruffles, a lot of things like overlap stitching are actually really hard to see on the finished garment, so you don't need to worry about them so much. So I'm just going to continue stitching here. And I'm going to continue doing exactly this. I want probably about 4 inches that I'm going to be doing here. So it'll be quite a few bobbins and a little bit of time to get this finished. I'll join you again when I'm closer to the end. Okay, I'm back to where I'm going to end my gathering, just because based on the pattern of the skirt and where I am right now, the print on the fabric, I think that I've got enough of a waistband to be comfortable for myself to wear this. So I'm just going to overlap this last line of stitching a little bit, and then instead of using the cutting function on my machine, I am going to make sure to pull this out and leave myself some long thread tails to work with. So now let's go over to the ironing board and look at how to finish this up. Okay, so here's the back side of my skirt. You can see that every time we shift it over, I kind of went a little bit over to the side, and that's to be expected because you are overlapping each row by a few stitches. That's perfectly fine. I've also got some thread tails on the back here from where I started, where I reloaded my bobbin, and then where I ended. So what I want to do with those thread tails is I'm actually going to gently pull and get enough of the front thread to come through the back side that I can pull that as well. And then I want to knot those two together. And this was part of leaving the longer threads. That one I'm going to have to go knot with a needle, I think. This was part of leaving the longer threads, which I did not do a great job of right there. But here with the bobbin thread, there we go, I've got a longer piece. So I'm just going to take these two pieces of thread, the elastic and the regular thread, and I'm going to tie them in knots, and that'll hold that, and that'll let me go back now and I can snip off this piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and knot the bottom, and then the top here, what I'll do, since I can't quite find that thread, I think it's there, I'm just going to have to pull and get closer to it than I can when I've got it in front of the camera. So I'll knot both of those, and then we'll show you what happens to this when you press it. So here's my skirt. I've gone ahead and taken care of those loose ends. I was able to pull enough up to knot that on the top there. And I'm going to turn it right side out. And you can see that this is already a lot smaller than my waist. I wish my waist was that little, but nope, not since I was about 7. Anyways, to get it to shrink up just a little bit more, to make sure that the elastic has got all its shrink, I'm just gonna gently on the right side, I'm gonna iron it up, and I'm using a lot of steam. And you can see as the steam clears how this starts to shrink even more, and it really tightens up that elastic thread. So I've hit this with some steam, and now this waistband is good to go. All I have to do to put it on is just stretch and wear it.